I raised him like he was my own blood. I believed the boy who once called me sweet grandma would be the last to betray me. But on my 80th birthday, he handed me a folder and said, "Just sign. It's all for your safety." My hands trembled not from age, but because I saw it in his eyes. He wasn't that boy anymore. That night I left home, and the letter my husband hid for decades burned everything to the ground. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to follow more powerful emotional stories from us. The light through the arched windows had that amber hue only late October could offer, warm, rich with a hint of dying fire. It spilled across the polished hardwood of the Moore estate's great dining room, glinting off decades of family silverware and the carefully ironed linen napkins folded just so. At the head of the long table sat Lianne Moore, spine straight, despite the pain in her lower back, her pearl earrings catching the light like tiny orbs of resilience. 80 today. The number sounded absurd in her own head. 80 wasn't old, not anymore, not until your hands began shaking just enough to make signing your name feel like an effort. Not until people started using words like legacy and estate in every conversation with a smile far too tight. Her birthday cake was an understated lemon chiffon, just the way she liked it. Around the table sat people who, if you were to freeze the scene and examine each face, looked as though they belonged. Yet even without the bickering, the passive glances, the occasional flicker of impatience when a story took too long, Lianne knew half of them were here out of habit, or worse, duty. And then there was Kyle, her grandson, her only grandchild, her late daughter Marie's only son. At 40, Kyle looked the part of the polished young politician's square jaw, clean-cut hair, the navy blue suit tailored within an inch of its life. He had the voice of someone who'd grown up learning how to soften hard truths for the camera, and the handshake of someone always one step away from a campaign donation. Now he stood raising a glass of champagne in a toast that seemed practiced, maybe even rehearsed. He smiled broadly, that politician's smile full of teeth but empty of warmth. To my remarkable grandmother, he said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon, "Lianne Moore, our family's compass, our North Star. The woman who taught me that strength doesn't shout, it whispers, that grace doesn't demand, it endures." The table responded with the expected polite claps, some genuine, others obligatory. Lianne smiled faintly. She had long learned to recognize the difference between love and performance. "Thank you, Kyle," she said, her voice even gracious. "That was beautiful." He leaned in and gave her a peck on the cheek. I meant every word he whispered, too low for the others to hear. But the speed with which he sat back down, already glancing at his phone in his lap, betrayed his impatience. His gaze flicked toward the study door. The party rolled on. Champagne flowed. Music, soft jazz from a vintage record player in the corner, wrapped around the guests like velvet. Conversations layered over one another, recipes, cruise plans, golf scores. Lianne drifted through them. Her mind fogged her eyes, scanning faces that had changed with time. Some she'd known for decades, some she didn't even remember inviting. Then it happened, a light knock on the dining room door. The butler stepped in quietly, carrying a small box wrapped in gold tissue and topped with a modest black ribbon. "Ma'am," he said, "this just arrived from Mr. Archer's shop." Lianne's fingers paused above her napkin. Her heart gave a small, strange twist. She knew exactly what it was. "Thank you, Douglas," she said. She unwrapped the box, slowly aware of Kyle's curious glance. Inside, nestled in navy blue velvet, lay the pocket watch, Robert's watch, her late husband's favorite timepiece, damaged in a drawer fall 5 years earlier. Forgotten until last month, when she'd found it and sent it to Archer's, an old watchmaker who still knew the craft. It gleamed now, polished and ticking softly. She lifted it gently, cradling it in her palm. Her fingers found the latch and pressed. Click! The back popped open. A folded piece of paper was tucked inside. No one else noticed. The conversation swirled around her like wind through tall grass, loud and meaningless. She unfolded the paper slowly, her fingertips trembling. It was handwritten, slanted neat, unmistakably Robert's. Lianne, if you're reading this, then time has finally caught me. And I suppose I deserve that. There's something I never told you. I couldn't, because I knew it would break you. The truth is, the fortune you think I built with sweat and service wasn't all clean. During the post-war years, I was part of a reconstruction committee tasked with allocating funds to rebuild after the devastation. But not all of those funds made it where they should have. I justified it, then said it was for us, for our family. Said we deserved it after what the world took from us. I was wrong. The money that bought the house, the boat, even Kyle's first private school tuition, it was tainted. I should have come clean. I was too much a coward. If this ever reaches your hands, forgive me, and do with this truth what you feel is right. Robert. She stared at the page for what felt like an hour. Her hands were ice. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribcage. The world did not spin. It tilted. Robert. Her Robert. The man who never once missed a mortgage payment, who built everything on the back of decency and hard work, or so she believed. The man who went to church every Sunday, who told Kyle to look people in the eye and earn their handshake. He'd stolen it, not from a neighbor, not from a company, from the country, from history, from people rebuilding their lives from rubble. And with that stolen fortune, he built this life, the life they lived, the life she thought was noble. The chandelier above seemed to dim. The laughter around her, once comforting, now grated like a dull knife against her spine. Grandma Kyle's voice. She blinked. He was watching her brow furrowed. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, but it came out hoarse, just memories. She folded the letter back with deliberate care and slipped it inside her cardigan pocket. Her fingers found the watch again. She pressed the lid shut. Click. The sound was so final it rang in her ears. She excused herself from the table with an apologetic smile and made her way down the corridor to the solarium. The late sun filtered through the glass walls, casting long shadows across the tile floor. She sank into the chair beside the fern that Robert used to trim every Saturday. For a moment she didn't move. She just stared out at the back garden. How many lies had rooted themselves in that soil? How many dinners, vacations, celebrations had been funded by pain she never saw? The pain of people whose names she didn't know, whose cities never rebuilt quite right, whose schools remained rubble while hers flourished. The enormity of it cracked something in her chest. And yet, she couldn't cry. Not yet. There was no space for it, only silence. From the other room, she could hear Kyle laughing like a man already practicing press conferences in his sleep. What would he say if he knew? What would he do? That thought chilled her more than the letter. She stood drawing herself up to her full height, shoulders squaring in the glass reflection. She had decisions to make, but not tonight. Tonight she would let them all eat their cake. And tomorrow she'd begin the long, hard journey of rewriting the ending to a story she thought had already been written. She stepped back into the dining room, a soft smile on her lips. Kyle raised his glass again, oblivious. "To 80 more years," he said, grinning. She clinked her glass to his. But in her mind she had already packed her bags, and the ticket already bought, for the train leaving at 7:07. The evening had stretched thin by the time the last of the guests filtered out their farewells, sticky with politeness and aftertaste. Lianne had heard the same phrases a dozen times. "You look amazing for 80. What a beautiful evening. We should do this again soon." All delivered with the mechanical warmth of people fulfilling a social obligation. The house felt quiet in their absence. Too quiet. The kind that creeps beneath your skin when all the laughter is gone, and what remains are shadows and the faint clink of glassware waiting to be washed. She was carrying a small tray of empty champagne flutes back to the kitchen when she heard the unmistakable sound of deliberate footsteps on the oak floors. Not casual, not meandering, purposeful. "Grandma." Lianne turned. Kyle was standing near the base of the stairs, his navy blazer unbuttoned, now shirt sleeves rolled up as if shedding the performance of dinner. His expression had shifted too. Gone was the rehearsed grandson smile. In its place something tighter, edged. "I was hoping we could talk privately." She nodded slowly and gestured toward the library. "Let's." The library was her favorite room in the house. Cedar-paneled walls, floor-to-ceiling shelves that smelled of dust and time, the fireplace cold but still commanding. She'd spent years here reading, thinking, remembering. It had been Robert's space once, then hers alone. Kyle moved first, settling into the leather wingback across from the antique writing desk. Lianne sat at the edge of the matching chair, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a moment of silence between them, not awkward, just quiet, like the stillness before a verdict. Kyle cleared his throat, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "You know I love you, right?" Lianne didn't respond, not yet, just watched him. "I mean it," he continued. "You're the cornerstone of this family. You've always been. That's why I want to talk to you about logistics, future planning, future." She waited. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a thin, neatly stapled packet. The sound of paper on wood was sharper than it should have been. "I've had a legal team draw up a few things. Nothing binding. Yet." He offered a rehearsed chuckle. "Think of this as a suggestion draft for your review." "What kind of suggestion?" Kyle looked up, eyes searching her face. "You've been managing the estate alone for 15 years now?" 17, she corrected softly. "Exactly." He leaned back slightly, adopting the tone of someone trying to sound reasonable. "And I know you've done an incredible job. But you're 80 now, Grandma. And let's be honest, things can change quickly at that age." The words hung in the air, cold and clinical. "I'm not dying, Kyle. I'm not saying you are," he said quickly. "But being prepared isn't the same as being pessimistic. This house, the trusts, the investment accounts. It's a lot to juggle. And if God forbid something happened to you, we'd be scrambling to sort through everything." "So this is for my convenience?" she asked. He blinked. "Of course." She picked up the packet. Her fingers moved through the pages slowly. Titles, bolded, assets listed. Contingency plans outlined. One line stood out in quiet, brutal clarity. "Transfer of title primary residence to Kyle Moore effective upon signatory confirmation." She closed the packet and set it down without a sound. "You're asking me to give you the house." "I'm asking you to let me help," Kyle replied. "To ease the burden and protect the legacy of this family. You'd retain full residence rights, of course. Nothing would change for you, except everything." "Why now?" she asked. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "I'm launching my Senate campaign in 3 months," he said finally. "We're close to announcing. We've got momentum funding, real backing from the party. But campaigns at that level need serious capital. This house, the property, the accounts, if we reposition some assets, leveraged a portion for collateral." She held up one hand. "I see, Grandma, don't," she said, and the word landed sharper than either of them expected. Kyle straightened, caught off guard. "I've spent years watching you become this version of yourself. Always moving, always networking, always reaching. And I told myself it was your ambition, that it would make you strong." She took a breath. "I didn't realize you were just grooming me for a transaction. That's not fair, isn't it?" Her voice remained calm, but inside something had fractured, not snapped, but shifted. "Do you remember what you called me when you were little?" she asked. Kyle's brow furrowed, wary of the turn. "You used to say, 'My sunshine grandma,' even when you scraped your knee or lost your favorite toy. You'd run into this room, throw yourself into my arms, and say, 'My sunshine grandma will fix it.'" He said nothing. "You stopped calling me that when you turned 14, around the time your mother died. That's when you started looking at me differently. Not as a person, but as an asset." Kyle leaned back, visibly trying to regroup. "This isn't personal." "It is to me. Look." His voice sharpened, lost the warmth. "This isn't just about me. You think I'm the only one who benefits if you set things up properly. You think probate court is going to be gentle when you're gone. You think they won't eat this estate alive in fees and delays. I'm trying to protect your legacy." "You mean you're trying to fund your future?" Same difference. There it was. No more mask, no more press conference smile. She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something cold settle in her chest. The boy she raised, the one who used to draw her birthday cards with crayons and sleep curled up on the floor of her bedroom. During thunderstorms, he wasn't here. Maybe he never was. "You're asking me to prepay my funeral in equity," she said, "before I'm even done living." Kyle scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." "And you..." she continued, her voice rising just slightly. Want to build your power on top of everything your grandfather and I bled for. You're standing on a stolen foundation, Kyle. What are you talking about? She almost told him, almost pulled out the letter and dropped it on the desk between them. But not yet. Not now. You think I built this house alone? She asked instead. You think Robert built it alone? He opened his mouth, then closed it. She stood slowly. Her hands no longer trembled. I'm not signing over anything tonight. You're making a mistake. No, she said, I'm seeing clearly. Kyle stood to anger, tightening his jaw. You've always said family comes first. I believed that once. He stared at her, then down at the packet of legal papers, so tidy, so confident in its own authority. When he looked up again, something in his face had changed. Gone was the slick campaigner. What replaced it was harder, more dangerous. I've worked too hard for this campaign to lose it, because you got sentimental. Lianne's lips curled faintly. Then you'd better work harder. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of paper being stuffed angrily back into a bag. She didn't look back, not when he called her name once, not when his voice sharpened into something near a curse, not even when he said, "You'll regret this," because what she regretted most had already happened. She had loved him, and he had seen that love as a currency. The house creaked in the silence after midnight, a kind of aching stillness only old places knew. It wasn't just the settling of wood or the moan of wind beneath the eaves. It was memory thick in the air pressing against the walls, the same walls that had heard first laughs and final words, the same walls that had sheltered love and now suspicion. Lianne moved through the quiet like a ghost. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to. She knew every inch of this place. She could navigate it in the dark with a tray of tea and a cane if she had to. But tonight there was no tray, only a small leather bag, worn at the handles, Robert's initials still faintly embossed at the side. She packed deliberately, not like someone running, like someone deciding. A silk scarf, the hand mirror her mother gave her on her wedding day, the envelope, the letter, and the watch. She stood for a long time at the foot of the staircase, looking upward, not for a forgotten item, but for the echoes. The family portraits loomed along the wall, watching with indifferent eyes. She had sat at the base of these stairs the night Marie died, held Kyle as he sobbed into her shoulder, his 14-year-old grief soaking through her cardigan like a storm with no warning. She had made herself steal that night because someone had to, and because a boy had needed someone to hold his world together. But now that boy had sharpened into a man who calculated affection. And Lianne had run out of reasons to pretend she didn't see it. She stepped into the study. The old lamp on the desk glowed amber. She hadn't turned it off earlier. Some part of her had known she'd return. She opened the drawer, pulled out a sheet of stationery, heavyweight, cream-colored, the kind you used for condolences or confessions. She wrote slowly, clearly, every stroke deliberate. Kyle, I raised you to believe that truth mattered, and for too long I failed to live by that. The fortune you've counted on, the legacy you believe so noble it is stained. Your grandfather wasn't the man we both wanted him to be. He took money that was never his, and I stayed silent long after I knew. That silence ends now. I'm leaving. I need time to understand who I am apart from the shadows this house has kept. And Kyle, know this, the secret of your grandfather is no longer ours. What happens next is up to me. She signed it with a hand that didn't tremble. She folded the letter and slipped it inside the envelope with no name on the front. No need. He would know. She placed it atop the oak desk just left of Robert's brass pen holder. Then she stood and took one last look around the room. The rug still had that faint indentation from Robert's chair. The old records were still stacked beside the phonograph. It was all still his and hers, but she didn't belong to it anymore. By 4:30 a.m., she was dressed in a gray wool coat scarf tied neatly beneath her chin, her bag over her shoulder. The sky outside the kitchen window was still dark, but there was a bruised edge of light pressing against the horizon. Dawn was coming. Douglas the butler had offered to drive her the night before, when she'd quietly asked him what time the first train left for Chicago, but she'd declined. I need to go alone, she'd said, and he had nodded, not asking why. Now she moved down the gravel path toward the waiting cab. The driver didn't say much, just took the address and glanced at her in the mirror, once something in his eyes softening as he saw her hands clutching the worn strap of her bag a little too tightly. Union Station was quiet at that hour. The floor glistened under the overhead lamps recently mopped. An old man in a janitor's uniform whistled faintly as he swept near the far gate. Lianne moved slowly, but with purpose. The heels of her boots clicked softly against the marble. She bought her ticket in cash. The woman at the counter smiled and asked if she needed assistance. No, Lianne said, just direction. The train would depart at 7:07 sharp. She took a seat near the platform entrance. Not in the lounge too plush, too watched. Just one of the metal benches, cold and straightforward where the world didn't expect you to smile. Around her, the station began to fill in slow trickles. Business travelers, a young couple whispering over coffee, a soldier with a duffel bag and eyes too old for his face. Lianne opened her bag, pulled out the photograph. It was worn, the corners curling, the color faded to a wash of gray and brown. But the faces were clear. Ellis and her, standing in front of a theater in Chicago, she in a polka dot dress, he in uniform fresh from Korea. His arm was around her waist, her head tilted slightly toward him. They looked absurdly young. They had been. She traced his smile with her fingertip. Ellis Shaw. He had wanted to marry her once, had stood on her porch with a ring he couldn't afford hands shaking. She'd said no, not because she didn't love him, but because Robert Moore had come back from the war with a bank job and her father's approval. She had watched Ellis walk away that night, the headlights of his car shrinking into the dark, and told herself she had chosen stability. Robert had given her a home, but Ellis had given her truth, and she had walked away from it. She didn't know if he still lived in Chicago. Last she heard, he'd become a journalist, one of the last ink-stained purists in a world gone digital. She'd seen his name once in a byline about corporate corruption. He'd looked the same in the photo beside it, older, grayer, but still Ellis. Still the man who used to write her poems on paper napkins. She folded the picture and returned it to her coat pocket. The train's arrival was announced over the loudspeakers. Her hands didn't shake as she stood. She moved with the others slowly, steadily down the corridor to the platform where the massive silver body of the train waited like a beast at rest. The 7:07 to Chicago. 100 windows, 100 possible reinventions. She stepped aboard, found her seat beside the window halfway down the car. She didn't look back as the train pulled out of the station. She only pressed her palm against the cool glass and watched the world slide past. The trees, the warehouses, the sleeping city. Behind her, a house full of portraits. Ahead of her, a city of questions. And somewhere between them, a man who once told her that silence was just another kind of lie. She wasn't lying anymore. She was leaving. Not running, not hiding, just finally going. Chicago greeted her with the kind of gray morning that didn't bother hiding its melancholy. The sky was flat and colorless. The air, wet with the memory of last night's rain, clung to Lianne's coat like breath. But the city was awake, alive, moving, unapologetic in its pace. She hadn't been here in over 5 decades. And yet the city had a strange way of folding around her like an old coat you hadn't worn since youth but still fit somehow. Or perhaps it fit now in a way it never did before. The cab dropped her off on a corner near Lincoln Park, where the buildings were close and old, where ivy still tried to climb the brick. She didn't need to check the address. The cafe was still there, tucked between a bookstore and a florist that smelled of eucalyptus and memory. Its name had changed, but the awning was the same faded green. She stepped inside the bell above the door, chiming with the same crisp note she remembered from the last time, 1958. The cafe was small, maybe 8 tables. No music, just the clatter of ceramic and the low hum of conversation. A young woman behind the counter glanced up, smiled automatically. Lianne didn't smile back. She scanned the room. He was sitting by the window, back straight, hands around a chipped white mug. Reading the newspaper, not a tablet or phone, but the physical folding kind, ink smudging his fingertips. Ellis Shaw. She would have known him anywhere. His hair was silver now, not gray and thinner at the temples. His jaw had softened. But the eyes, The eyes were the same, sharply observant, faintly amused, like they were always waiting for you to say something worth listening to. She stepped forward and paused just beside the table. "It's still too early for bourbon and coffee, isn't it?" she said softly. Ellis looked up, and for one long, heavy second nothing happened. Then the paper fell. "Lianne," he said. She smiled. Not because she felt like smiling, but because she couldn't help it. "Yes." He stood too quickly, almost knocking over his mug. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. His voice hadn't changed either. "I must look like a ghost," she said gently. "No," he said, just like time finally blinked. They stood like that, suspended between decades. Then Ellis remembered himself. "Sit, please." She lowered herself into the chair across from him, suddenly aware of how fragile her body had become. Her knees ached, her fingers trembled more than she wanted them to. He was still standing, staring at her like she might vanish. "Can I get you something?" he asked. "Tea," she said. "If they have Earl Grey. I'm too old to change tastes now." He flagged the server and ordered it for her without looking away. When he sat again, it was slowly, carefully, as if the world had narrowed to just their small corner of Chicago. "You look good," he said finally. "I mean it." "I look like a woman who's about to ruin everything," she replied. That made him blink. His brows drew together. She reached into her coat and pulled out the envelope. Not the one for Kyle. The other. The one that still carried the weight of a truth her hands barely wanted to touch. She slid it across the table. Ellis didn't move at first. He just looked at it, then at her. "What is it?" "Proof," she said. "Of a crime. Of a man you once hated for marrying me. Of the reasons you were probably right to." Ellis hesitated, then picked it up. The paper unfolded slowly. She watched his eyes as they scanned the lines. Watched the shift happen, the narrowing of his pupils, the stillness in his breath. Watched the jaw tighten just slightly, the way it always had when he was fighting the urge to say something before he was ready. When he finished, he set it down with a kind of reverence. Silence hung between them like dust motes in a sunbeam. He looked up. His voice was quieter now, raw. "How long have you known?" "I found it 5 days ago," she said. "In Robert's watch. It was hidden behind the mechanism. The jeweler must have loosened it during repairs. It fell into my hand like a stone." Ellis didn't speak. "I should have known," she continued, "or maybe I did. And I just chose not to look. We all have our convenient blind spots, don't we?" He tapped the edge of the letter. This is enough to open an investigation, if anyone still cared to look. This money, this theft, it was buried deep and wide. But this letter, this could blow it open." She nodded once. "I don't want it buried anymore." He stared at her. "You're Robert Moore's widow. This letter implicates him in a decades-old embezzlement scandal involving federal reconstruction funds. And you're sitting here telling me to make it public." "I am." "And Kyle," she flinched. "He saw it." "He's your grandson, isn't he?" Ellis said softly. She looked out the window. The rain had begun again, tracing soft rivers down the glass. "He's running for the Senate," she said. The Moore legacy continued. The name, the charm, the ambition. But none of the conscience. He came to me a week ago asking me to sign over the estate, said it was to help me manage it before I got too old. But it was about the money, always the money. Ellis folded his hands. "And this is your response?" "No," she said. "This is my apology. To everyone I failed by staying silent." He leaned back, exhaled slowly. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you were the first person who ever told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. And because you're the only person I know who still believes that the truth matters." He was quiet for a long moment. Then finally, "Do you know what this will do to your name, to Kyle's campaign, to your family?" "I don't have a family," she said. "Not anymore. I have a bloodline. There's a difference." Ellis nodded, looked down at the letter again. "When I was 27, he said quietly, I tried to write a piece on post-war corruption, real estate fraud, misallocated government funds. Everyone laughed me out of the newsroom. That's ancient history, they said. People don't care about old crimes. I told them they should." She reached across the table, touched his hand. "They still can." The server brought her tea. Neither of them touched it. He picked up the letter once more, held it with 2 hands like something sacred. "Okay," he said. She exhaled, not relief, but something adjacent to it. "I'll need more," Ellis added. Documentation, context. If I'm going to do this right, it has to be airtight. You understand? I kept everything she said. Robert's old files, ledgers, letters. They're in a lockbox in the basement. He nodded, then smiled. Not wide, just true. You always did know how to drop a bomb, he said. And you always knew how to write about the ashes. They sat in silence after that, not awkward, not empty, just honest, like time had finally stopped lying to them both. The first thing Ellis did after Lianne left the cafe was call the one person he still trusted in a newsroom. It wasn't anyone at the Tribune. They'd long since replaced substance with clickbait and sold off their conscience to whoever had the deepest pockets. No Ellis called Marcia Greer a stubborn, foul-mouthed researcher he'd worked with on a corruption series a decade ago, back when papers still had budgets for digging, not just reposting press releases. She answered on the third ring. You're calling me at 6 a.m. Either you're dying or someone is. Maybe both, Ellis said. He gave her the short version, the letter, the confession, the dates, the names. He didn't mention Kyle yet, not until he could verify the connections. By the end of the call, Marcia had already booted up her laptop and muttered, God, I've missed this. They started that afternoon. Ellis worked from a rented studio in River North, a windowless room with a coffee pot that groaned louder than it brewed. The walls were quickly covered in corkboards, red string sticky notes, and scanned copies of the letter. Lianne delivered the lockbox as promised ledgers, correspondence photographs, even hand-drawn maps of funding routes used during Robert Moore's time on the Reconstruction Board. The money trail was old, ancient by modern standards, but it bled forward, branching, snaking, splitting into shell corporations and trusts that sounded charitable on paper, but when followed closely unraveled like bad stitching. One of the earliest flagged patterns came from a Veterans Rehabilitation Relief Fund, established in 1952 and shuttered in 1959. Robert had signed 2 memos recommending its expansion funded by redirected disaster relief grants. The fund dissolved after a Senate inquiry, but oddly no charges were filed. Ellis found that odd, and then he saw why. Many of those dissolved assets had quietly reappeared in the Horizon Collective founded in the 1980s, this time under the name of a holding trust managed by Robert's close friend and former deputy. And now the Horizon Collective had a high-profile honorary director listed on their site, Kyle Moore. Ellis sat back in his chair, stared at the screen. It wasn't proof of guilt, not yet. But it was a blood vein leading out of a scar, and it pulsed all the way to Kyle's polished campaign website. He printed everything, then called Marcia. I need to know who's really running Horizon, who's on payroll, who funds them, who their donors are. Follow every board member. Follow the ones they don't list. She groaned. I already hate you again. Good. That means we're doing it right. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of a Virginia estate, Kyle Moore stood in his grandmother's study holding her note. His jaw tightened with every line. His phone buzzed. Again, his assistant. Again. She's not in D.C., the voice stammered. We've checked her usual doctors, the clubs, the driver hasn't seen her. Kyle pinched the bridge of his nose. Then check her credit cards. She's old. She wouldn't think to use cash. They did, and it didn't take long. A train ticket from Union Station, a cafe receipt, a florist, all in Chicago. Jesus, Kyle muttered, staring at the transaction log. She's really gone. His assistant hesitated. Should we be worried? Kyle didn't answer. Because yes, he was worried, not just about where she was, but who she might be with. He remembered that name, Ellis Shaw, from old family stories, from a few grainy photos he'd once seen tucked into the corner of an album. He remembered asking, "Who's that?" and being told flatly, "An old friend, a journalist, not important." But now his grandmother had disappeared armed with secrets and regrets. And if she was with a man like Shaw, well, that meant one thing. She wasn't running from something. She was heading toward it. Back in Chicago, Ellis and Marcia's progress was accelerating. By day 4, they had mapped out the entire corporate network of the Horizon Collective. They'd traced more than $18 million in donations from defense contractors, oil companies, and development agencies, most of whom had benefited from federal reconstruction subsidies post-conflict. This whole thing, Marcia said one night, stabbing a thumbtack into a document, is an elegant fraud. They funneled guilt money through charity wrappers and handed it off to insiders, and Kyle's sitting on top of it like a damn eagle. He knows, Ellis said. Knows what? That we're coming. Marcia raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? Ellis opened an envelope that had arrived that morning. No return address, no name. Just a single page, typed, no signature. You don't know what you're digging into. Some graves don't want to be disturbed. Some names don't want to be spoken. Marcia went quiet. This showed up where she asked. My mailbox. Anyone else see it? No. She took the paper with gloved fingers and slipped it into a folder. We'll have it scanned for prints, but I doubt we'll find anything. Whoever sent this knew how to erase themselves. Ellis leaned forward. I think it's time we publish something. Just a teaser, she asked. Enough to rattle the cage. Just enough to shake the tree, he said. Let's see what falls out. So they did. The next day, a small independent outlet, The Ridgeline, published a digital brief authored by E. Shaw and M. Greer. Preliminary evidence suggests that a long-defunct Reconstruction Fund may have links to modern political campaigns via shadow nonprofit networks. A larger investigative series is in development. More soon. It wasn't a bomb. It was a tremor, and Kyle felt it instantly. Within hours, his campaign manager called. What is this thing online? Are they naming names? No, Kyle said. Not yet. Do we respond? No, Kyle said again. We wait, and we watch who moves first. But someone already had. That evening, Ellis received another envelope. This one wasn't empty. Inside was a burned photo, half disintegrated but still legible. It was of a younger Marcia laughing with a toddler at a public park. On the back was written, You're not the only one with things to lose. Marcia went pale when she saw it. They've been watching me, she whispered. Ellis cursed under his breath. I shouldn't have brought you into this. I brought myself, she said. You know that. Still, it changed things. They moved operations to a rented apartment under a different name. Burned every document they didn't digitize. Switched to encrypted drives. No emails, no cloud. Ellis called Lianne from a burner phone, gave her a short version of the situation. I'm sorry, he said. We may have put you in danger. But her voice was calm, steady. I left danger the moment I left the house. This is just the consequence. There was a pause. Then they're scared, she said. Yes, good. That night Ellis couldn't sleep. He sat by the window staring out into the Chicago dark, the city pulsing around him like an organism too big to know what any single part was doing. He thought about Robert Moore. He thought about Lianne. And he thought about Kyle somewhere out there spinning stories, pulling strings, getting ready to bury them all if it came to that. But Ellis also knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had the truth. And now it was only a matter of who would bleed from it first. The rain had stopped, but the city still wore its wetness like a wound shiny tender and unhealed. The sidewalk in front of the Ambassador Hotel glistened under the street lamps. Inside the lobby exhaled that cold elegance only old hotels knew, marble floors, brass elevators, and chandeliers that remembered presidents. Lianne had chosen this place deliberately. Quiet, unassuming. The kind of hotel where the staff didn't ask questions unless you invited them to. She liked the way the curtains swayed even with the windows closed. She liked the way the carpet muffled her footsteps. She did not like the man standing in the hallway outside her suite. Kyle. He was leaning against the doorframe, suit damp from the rain, hair disheveled not from style but from impatience. His jaw clenched when he saw her exit the elevator, and for a second he didn't speak. Then, You've really gone insane. Lianne didn't flinch. She moved slowly toward the door, keys in hand, never breaking eye contact. You tracked my credit card, she said flatly. You left me no choice, Kyle replied. You vanish. No calls, no explanation. And then I find out you're holed up in a hotel with a disgraced journalist. What the hell are you doing? Lianne unlocked the door but didn't open it. She turned to face him fully. I'm doing what I should have done 20 years ago, she said. I'm telling the truth. Kyle stepped closer, dropping his voice. You've always been dramatic, Grandma, but this isn't just drama, it's delusion. Don't, she warned, voice low. You think people are going to care about some rusty old paper trail from the 50s? You think anyone's going to believe you over a man who's been dead for 3 decades? Lianne opened the door slowly. Come in, Kyle. Let's not make a scene in the hallway. He hesitated, then followed. The suite was modest, 2 rooms, a small balcony, no grandeur, but it felt warmer than the Moore estate had in years. Lianne poured herself a glass of water, offered him nothing. He stood stiffly near the fireplace, arms folded. She sat by the window beneath the lamplight. "This is madness," he said. "You know that, right? You're 80 years old. You're not well. You're vulnerable." She took a sip. "I'm sharper now than I've ever been." Kyle paced, his tone sharpened. "You don't understand what you're risking. My name is tied to that foundation, yes, but I had nothing to do with whatever shady deals grandfather made. And if you stir this up now, the blowback doesn't hit him. It hits me. It hits the campaign. It hits everything we've worked for." Lianne looked at him calmly. "Worked for?" "Yes," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how much I've sacrificed? How many nights I've slept 4 hours? How many donors I've had to charm? How many lies I've had to swallow for the sake of the game? Sounds exhausting." He ignored her. "You think your little morality play is noble, but it's not. It's suicidal. You'll ruin yourself. And me. For what? A ghost's guilt." "You're not afraid of being ruined, Kyle," she said quietly. "You're afraid of being revealed." That stopped him. His mouth opened, but no words came. "You didn't just benefit from Robert's legacy," she continued. "You expanded on it. You studied it. You sharpened it. You used it to build something you don't deserve." Kyle took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't get to talk to me like that. Not after what I've done for this family." "No," she said. "You don't get to use the word family like a shield anymore." He stared at her, and then he said the line that would sever everything. "I'm filing for emergency guardianship," he said coldly. "You've shown signs of cognitive decline. You've isolated yourself. You're behaving irrationally. You're in contact with unstable individuals. If you don't return home and drop this obsession, I'll have a judge rule you unfit to manage your estate. And I'll take control of everything." The words echoed in the silence like a slap. Lianne rose slowly from her chair. Her face was pale, but her voice, when it came, was steel. "Is that why you came here, Kyle? To threaten your grandmother into silence, into surrender?" "I came to save you from yourself," he said, jaw tight. "No," she said. "You came to make sure the woman you thought was dying quietly didn't start talking." His mouth twisted. "This isn't personal. You're standing in my room," she said, stepping toward him, "telling me you'll have me declared insane if I don't relinquish control of my own life. There is nothing more personal than that. You're forcing me." "No," she said, her voice suddenly sharper. "You made your choice the moment you saw me as an obstacle instead of a person. You lost me long before this." Kyle's voice cracked. "I'm your grandson." "You were," she whispered. "But blood doesn't guarantee love, and it certainly doesn't guarantee loyalty." He stepped closer again, this time too close. "You want to fight," he hissed. "Fine. But I promise you, you will not win. I've already got doctors lined up who'll testify. 1 phone call and you're in a guardianship hearing by next week." And then, without raising her voice, without flinching, Lianne did something she hadn't done in 40 years. She slapped him. It wasn't hard, but it was enough. Enough to stop him. Enough to remind him that she had once been young, once been fierce, once held a fire inside her no man could bend. Kyle staggered back half a step, eyes wide. "You don't know what you've started," he whispered. She looked him in the eye, unblinking. "No," she said, "you don't." He stood there for a long moment, stunned, then turned and walked out. Didn't slam the door, didn't look back. When he was gone, Lianne sat back down and wept, but only for a minute. Then she picked up the phone and called Ellis. The morning after Kyle's threat, Ellis stood in front of the large window in his office, staring at the half-lit skyline like it might blink first. In one hand he held a folder. Inside, names, dates, routing numbers, ledger scans, signatures, all matched, all verified. The other hand held his phone. On the screen was a simple question from Marcia, ready to light the match. Ellis didn't answer right away. He looked over his shoulder where Lianne sat on the worn leather couch. Her hands clasped a cup of tea growing cold in her lap. She wasn't shaking. Not anymore. She had stopped shaking when Kyle walked out of that hotel suite. "Once this goes out," he said, "there's no taking it back." "I don't want to take it back," she said quietly. "I want it out of me." So Ellis nodded and hit send. Within hours, the full report went live first on the Ridge line, then picked up by independent investigative wires, then finally inevitably by mainstream media. A 12-page expose co-authored by Ellis Shaw and Marcia Greer titled The Horizon Illusion: How Post-War Corruption Built a Dynasty. It was methodical, precise, clinical. The lead paragraph was a slow dagger. Robert Moore, once praised for his post-war contributions to infrastructure rebuilding, is posthumously named in an embezzlement scandal involving federal funds with modern connections to political candidate Kyle Moore, his grandson and director of a nonprofit tied to the original money trail. Attached were photocopies of Robert's handwritten confession ledger excerpts showing transferred funds and tax filings from the Horizon Collective that listed donors who had once been flagged in Senate audits. The media reaction was immediate. By nightfall, it had become a breaking segment on every major network from PBS to cable opinion panels. CNN ran it with the headline, "Senate Hopeful Kyle Moore Implicated in Historical Money Laundering Network." MSNBC opened their 10 p.m. hour with "The Legacy Crumbles, the Moore Family and the Shadow of Theft." Even Fox News took a stab, though, from a different angle. Political witch hunt or legitimate scandal? The Moore controversy explodes. And in the center of it all, Kyle. He appeared the next day live at a press conference outside his campaign office. The wind whipped at his collar. He wore black, a tie too tight, eyes too wide. "There is no truth," he said, "to these wild, reckless allegations. I had no knowledge of my grandfather's dealings, assuming any of them are even true." The reporters pushed. Questions cut through the air like bullets. "Mr. Moore, were you aware of the ledger entries from 1984 bearing your initials as a minor beneficiary? Mr. Moore, do you deny authorizing the $240,000 disbursement to Centrail Trust looted last year? Did your grandmother Lianne Moore provide the documents cited in the report?" Kyle tightened his jaw. "I won't be commenting further." He turned away, ignoring the chaos behind him. But in his chest, a storm had broken loose, because the story had done more than hurt his campaign. It had ripped the spine out of his identity. At 11:42 p.m. that night, Lianne's phone rang. She didn't answer the first time, or the second, but on the third ring, something in her gut told her to pick up. "Kyle," she said. His voice came through low and feral. "Do you know what you've done?" She didn't reply. "You destroyed me," he growled. "You've set fire to everything our family ever built." "No," she said calmly. "I exposed what was never clean to begin with. I could go to prison. Yes, you'll be hated. You'll be remembered as the woman who betrayed her own blood for a headline." "No," she said again. "I'll be remembered as the woman who finally told the truth." The silence that followed was thick. Then came his voice again, this time more bitter than angry. "You're going to die alone, you know that." Lianne didn't flinch. "I already did. For 40 years. He fell quiet. She continued, her voice quiet, deliberate. "You thought I did this to hurt you. I didn't. You were already hurt. This is what healing looks like when you stop protecting rot. You'll regret this," he said, the old rage breaking through again. "You'll regret dragging this family name through the mud." She almost laughed. "Almost. Sweetheart," she said, "the name was in the mud long before I touched it." She hung up, and this time she didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply walked to the window of her apartment, the small, sunlit place she had rented on the edge of Lincoln Park, and sat down in the rocking chair Robert once made with his own hands. Outside, the city buzzed with a different kind of noise now, the kind that came when truth was no longer under wraps. Reporters outside campaign offices, microphones in every corner, people asking questions. Finally, Lianne stared out at the skyline. For the first time in her life, she felt like she wasn't hiding under someone else's story. She wasn't the widow anymore. She wasn't the keeper of secrets. She wasn't the facilitator of someone else's power. She was just herself, one woman, a name, a voice, a reckoning. And for the first time in decades, as she sat in the quiet flicker of moonlight and unspilled tea, she wasn't alone. She was enough. By the time the second week broke, Kyle Moore's name was everywhere and nowhere he wanted it to be. The Moore for Senate website was offline. His campaign headquarters, once wrapped in patriotic banners and aspirational slogans, now stood, stripped bare signage, peeled down windows, shuttered locks changed. The staff had vanished overnight, fleeing like rats from a sinking vessel. The first blow came from the Federal Election Commission, which suspended his campaign pending an ethics inquiry. The second came faster, when a state prosecutor in Virginia issued a subpoena for Kyle's financial records, citing probable cause for fraud, misuse of nonprofit assets, and intent to launder federal disaster relief funds. Then the banks followed. All 4 of Kyle's personal and political accounts were frozen. By the 3rd day, he couldn't even access his phone's Venmo. The next hit landed at the gates of the Moore estate, a 700-square-foot Georgian revival nestled behind a wrought iron fence and oak trees manicured to perfection. The county sheriff arrived just after dawn with a court order for asset seizure. The servants had already left. The housekeeper cried quietly on the steps as movers catalogued furniture and artwork. Even the Moore family crest, hand-stitched and framed in the front hall, was removed and boxed like evidence. Inside, Kyle stood at the top of the stairs barefoot, still in his dress shirt from the night before, watching his world unravel floor by floor. Sandra had packed her things without a word. She didn't take much, just her rings, her laptop, and the Cartier clutch he gave her on their 3rd anniversary. The rest, gifts, gowns, gold, were things she never loved to begin with. She didn't look back when she closed the front door. And Kyle, he didn't try to stop her, because some part of him knew it wasn't just his house being taken. It was the illusion that he was untouchable, that legacy was bulletproof, that charm and lineage and a little legal sleight of hand could make truth sit down and shut up. It couldn't, and it hadn't. The final blow came not from the press or the feds, but from a leak. An anonymous whistleblower released a trove of emails from inside the Horizon Resilience Network, a lesser-known nonprofit Kyle co-founded 5 years ago, supposedly to help rebuild schools in hurricane zones. The emails revealed that less than 12% of donated funds ever reached the affected areas. The rest was diverted to consulting firms, some of which were registered under shell companies in Kyle's name. Headlines screamed, "Kyle Moore's charity scam. Exposed relief funds, bought yachts, not schools. Grandson of political dynasty. Faces. Federal charges." The internet, ever merciless, began circulating a doctored photo of Kyle with the caption, "More money, more problems." And in every grocery line on every morning news show, people began to say the same phrase. How could someone do that to their own country? But Lianne didn't watch the news. Not anymore. She didn't gloat. She didn't toast victory. She didn't even say, "I told you so." Instead, she put on her black coat, folded a single piece of paper into her handbag, and called a cab. The cemetery was quiet that morning. Wind rustled the old maples along the gravel path. Squirrels darted between stone angels, and crows, as always, watched from the edges like black-clad jurors. She walked slowly, deliberately, until she found the headstone. Robert H. Moore, 1926-1997, husband, father, patriot. She stared at it a long time, then knelt slowly, painfully, and placed a single white lily at its base. Her hands lingered on the stem. "I waited a long time to bring you flowers," she said aloud. "I think I needed to be angry first." She sat back on her heels, ignoring the cold in her knees. "You know, for a long time I thought silence was love. That covering for your mistakes was the price I paid to protect our name, our future, our family, our—" Her voice caught. But it wasn't protection. It was betrayal of everyone we were supposed to be better for. She took out the paper from her bag, unfolded it. It was a printout of the confession letter. Not the original, just a copy. She read it aloud slowly, letting the words echo against the stones. Then she tore it in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall onto the earth. "Your legacy is buried with you," she said. "But our family name, it's not yours anymore. It's not even Kyle's. It's mine now, and I'll carry it differently." She stood. Her knees ached, but her spine did not bend. On her way out of the cemetery, she passed a groundskeeper who tipped his hat. She smiled and nodded a small gesture that felt oddly like closure. Back at her apartment, the mailbox was full. Letters from strangers, some handwritten, some typed, some anonymous. Most said the same thing: "Thank you for being brave enough to speak when others wouldn't." One envelope had no return address, only the words, "Rita J. Louisiana," scribbled in childlike cursive. Inside was a drawing, a child's sketch of a school with the words, "Hope Rebuilt," written in crayon. Lianne held the drawing for a long time. then placed it on the refrigerator held by a magnet shaped like a cardinal. She didn't know what would happen next. Whether Kyle would face trial, whether charges would stick, whether more names would surface. But she knew this. The dam had broken. The rot was exposed, and the air, though still bitter, felt lighter. That night she sat by the window again. The wind whispered through the leaves. The city lights blinked in a steady rhythm, and for the first time in her life she didn't feel like a keeper of secrets. She felt free. The office of Morrison and Bellman overlooked the Chicago River, its glass facade reflecting steel and history in equal measure. Inside, everything was beige and quiet carpeted halls, minimalist artwork, the kind of silence that didn't invite conversation but demanded decisions. Lianne sat across from a young estate attorney in a gray suit and navy tie, his hands folded neatly atop a stack of papers that could change everything. "This is the full transfer," he said. "If you sign here, the entirety of your remaining estate, estimated at $5.8 million, will be moved into the newly formed nonprofit under your name and mission statement. The tax structure is compliant, and the bylaws ensure that no future trustee can redirect the fund for anything other than its founding purpose." Lianne didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the thick window beside them, where a tugboat inched under the Wabash Bridge, pulling something too heavy for one alone. She turned back. "What's the public name of the fund?" The attorney flipped a page. "You wrote it in your notes, ma'am, the Atonement Fund." She nodded. "Good. I want that word to stay. Atonement. Not charity, not legacy, not hope. Atonement." He hesitated, then said, "It's unusual. Most people don't want the word associated with them." She met his eyes. Most people didn't help bury what needed to be atoned for. He swallowed and handed her the pen. She signed. Each letter was crisp, clear, the way her name hadn't been in decades, because this time it wasn't shadowed by anyone else's. When it was done, she stood. "Send the release to the press," she said. "All of it, no embargo. And make sure you include the list of intended beneficiaries." He raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" "Yes," she said. "Every community that was listed in those old ledgers, every town that waited on rebuilding money that never came, every family that stood in the rubble while men in suits signed off on yachts." He nodded slowly. Lianne walked out of the office with nothing in her purse but a small notebook, a folded map, and a picture of her daughter. No wallet, no cards, because now she had nothing to hide. The first headline came within hours. "Heiress to Moore family fortune establishes $5.8 million atonement fund for post-war victims." Then the subheads, "Calls it a moral debt owed by those who profited from silence." "Lianne Moore breaks with family legacy to repair history." Talk shows picked it up. Commentators argued over whether it was redemption or performance. Op-eds dissected her statement, analyzing each word like sacred text. But most just watched the video. A clip, 90 seconds long. Lianne standing in front of a small podium in a public park, surrounded by 2 rows of flowering trees. "My husband once told me we were building something for our children. He was wrong. We were building on something taken. This fund won't undo the harm, but it will stop pretending it never happened." And then she walked away. No Q&A, no applause, just silence. Meanwhile, across town, Kyle Moore was being led through a narrow side entrance at the Capitol Annex building, flanked by 2 attorneys and a press secretary who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. He wore a navy suit that no longer fit like armor. The collar sagged, the shoes scuffed. Inside the room was crowded camera crews along the walls. Committee members in semicircle formation, name placards neatly arranged. At the center was the chairwoman of the Ethics Committee. Her voice was cool, controlled. "Mr. Moore, do you confirm your association with the Horizon Resilience Network?" "Yes," Kyle replied. "And your title as co-founder and director of strategy?" "Yes." "Were you aware of the transfer of $4.2 million into affiliated shell corporations during the period between 2018 and 2022? I can't confirm the accounting. That's being reviewed." A murmur passed through the room. "Do you deny that your campaign received $1.7 million in bundled donations from those same corporations?" "I was not aware of any illegality." "And are you aware that your grandmother, Mrs. Lianne Moore, has submitted full financial disclosures to the Justice Department, which include handwritten ledgers from your grandfather's original illicit fund movement?" Kyle hesitated, and then gave the line the press would loop for the next 6 months. She's not my family anymore. The room fell silent. The chairwoman didn't respond. She didn't have to. The microphones did it for her. That evening, Lianne sat in the middle of Grant Arboretum, a new park built from what used to be a forgotten plot of industrial land. The city had revived it 5 years ago, turning it into a sanctuary of flowers and stone paths and whispering trees. She sat on a bench beneath a copper plaque that read, "To the forgotten towns we remember you now." Around her, saplings had begun to bloom, each marked with small tags, handwritten names. Laurel Creek, Chambly's Crossing, Sutton Vale, Old West Hampton, Red River Hollow, names most Americans never heard of, places most maps had stopped printing. But Lianne had read them all in the margins of Robert's ledgers. Communities where bridges collapsed and never got rebuilt, where homes flooded then burned, where children went to school in trailers because the money had vanished somewhere between Washington and the Caymans. She touched one tag gently. It fluttered in the breeze. A child ran past her on the path, chasing bubbles. Behind him, a young couple held hands, whispering about something in the leaves. The world kept going, but this part was hers. Her phone buzzed gently on the bench beside her. A message from unknown number. He said, "You're not his family anymore." She stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it. Because blood wasn't the thing that defined her. Truth was, and she had chosen it. She sat there until the sun dipped behind the line of buildings and the saplings threw long shadows on the grass. She didn't need to speak. The trees were saying enough. The morning air was soft, filtered through early light, and the delicate sound of leaves swaying in rhythm. The bench was old, iron-framed with wooden slats, smoothed by time, the kind of bench meant not for passing moments, but for staying, for remembering, for speaking the truths that had waited too long. Lianne sat at one end of it, a porcelain thermos beside her steaming gently. The steps approaching were measured familiar, even before the voice broke the quiet. "You still drink oolong." She didn't turn around right away. Instead, she smiled, "Only when the weather's uncertain." Ellis chuckled, easing down beside her with the kind of exhale that belongs to people who've lived long enough to appreciate silence. His face was older, yes, lined by decades of chasing truth and losing sleep, but his eyes were the same. Alert, kind, disarming in the way only someone who'd seen you raw could be. "You look peaceful," he said. That's a dangerous thing to say to a woman who just dismantled her family's fortune. They both laughed, the kind of laugh that floats easy in open air. Not triumphant, not bitter, just alive. Ellis poured them both tea. He handed her a small cup. She took it with 2 hands, a gesture from some other life. They drank in silence for a few moments. Then she spoke. "When I was younger, I thought love meant staying still." Ellis didn't interrupt. "I thought if I made myself small, polished, polite, invisible in the right ways, that meant I was doing it right. That I was a good wife, a good mother, a good ornament." She looked down at her tea. "I didn't even notice I stopped having my own opinions. I'd open my mouth and all I heard was him, his views, his jokes, his anger. I thought it was normal." Ellis watched her, not with pity, but with patience. "I remember," he said quietly, "the night you didn't come with me." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "I remember too. I told you I couldn't, that my place was with him, that we had plans." "You did," he said. "I didn't know then," she whispered, "that plans can also be cages." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above them. Lianne looked at Ellis, her voice gaining the firmness of someone who had found ground under her feet. "I used to believe I was just a shadow, a reflection of someone else's story. I kept every letter he wrote, wore the dress he liked, said the things that kept the room peaceful." Ellis tilted his head, and now, she smiled, "Now I know the silence wasn't peace. It was fear. And I know I had a voice all along. I just didn't know it could shake walls." Ellis reached out gently. His fingers found hers, not as a plea, not as nostalgia, but as an anchor. "You didn't just speak, Lianne," he said, voice low. "You shouted. And the whole damn world listened." She exhaled deeply. The kind of breath you take when you finally set something down that you've carried too long. They sat like that for a long moment, her hand in his, the world around them moving in a slow, respectful hush. The garden bloomed around them, New trees planted in honor of old truths. The past didn't vanish, but it softened in the light. It gave way to space, to growth, to choice. You know, Lianne said, I don't regret not running away with you. Ellis raised an eyebrow, amused. She clarified, I regret that I thought I didn't deserve to. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did, a loosening, a grace. You would have made a terrible runaway, he teased. You packed too many teacups. She chuckled. True, a beat. But now she said softly, I think I could pack lighter. Ellis didn't respond with words. Instead, he lifted his teacup in a quiet toast. To starting late, he said. She clinked her cup to his. To starting true, she replied. In the distance, children's laughter floated through the trees. The world was not perfect. It was not healed. But it was possible. And that was enough. It was almost exactly 1 year later to the day. Chicago's early spring bloomed soft and reluctant. The wind carried the familiar bite of Lake Michigan, but the sun broke through just enough to whisper that things were growing again, that even the coldest earth couldn't hold back new roots forever. On the corner of West Jackson and Canal, in the shadow of Union Station, a woman in a pale wool coat stood with a paper bag of apples and a folded newspaper tucked under her arm. Lianne Moore looked older but not smaller. Her gait had slowed, yes, but the stillness in her spine had been replaced by something firmer. She walked without waiting. Every morning she passed through Union Station not for a trip, but for a ritual. She bought a tea from the same small kiosk, nodded to the same guard, and paused always on the same marble bench facing Track 7, where the 7:07 a.m. train still came and went, where a year ago she had boarded not just a train, but a departure from a life of borrowed silence. Today the train pulled in, right on time. She sipped her tea, watching commuters shuffle in, a father with a lunchbox, a woman applying lipstick while scrolling through emails, a college student with sleep in his eyes. No one noticed her, and she liked it that way. Back in her small apartment, 3rd floor, no elevator, plenty of light. Lianne sat at her writing desk, the kind built not for show but for doing. A letter lay open, typed, printed, addressed formally, but personal, raw. Dear Mrs. Moore, we are pleased to inform you that through the Atonement Fund, a total of 38 families have successfully completed the restitution process. Their land deeds, business titles, and seized inheritances have been officially restored. Enclosed are several statements of acknowledgement from families wishing to thank you personally. The rest of the letter blurred beneath her tears, not the kind of tears that sting, the kind that warm the cheek. She ran her hand over the folder. Inside it were names she'd come to memorize, places that had become real to her. Sutton Vale, Granger Hills, Petty Crossing. Names that once lived only in footnotes. Now they had mailboxes again. Outside, the train horn blew faintly in the distance. She looked out the window and remembered what silence used to sound like. Across the country, a different story was unfolding. Kyle Moore now lived in a town no journalist cared to name. His campaign had folded within weeks of the scandal. Investigations multiplied. No one went to jail, but no one invited him back either. Disgraced wasn't the word he used, but it was the one everyone else did. He no longer spoke publicly. The few times his name appeared in small blogs or political podcasts, it was followed by words like fallen fraud or ghost. Friends fell away. Donors disappeared. Even his own party stopped returning his calls. The house in Westchester had been seized, his car auctioned, his personal accounts drained by legal fees and frozen assets. But the worst part, he didn't miss the money. He missed the audience. Back in Chicago, Lianne folded the letter carefully, placing it in a wooden box with her name carved across the lid. No misses, just Lianne. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd carried onto the train that first morning. Its last page held a single sentence written slowly. I am not the woman he made me. I am the woman I reclaimed. Then she closed it. She didn't need to write anymore, not today. Later that afternoon, Ellis arrived. Same hat, same eyes, a newspaper under his arm, and that same grin that could soften a revolution. He tapped lightly on her doorframe. Thought you might want a walk. Trees are blooming. She opened the door without a word, and they walked down Michigan Avenue, past bookstores and corner cafes. They spoke about nothing and everything. They pointed out dogs. They debated which movie was the best version of itself. They disagreed on raisins and cookies. Then as the sky turned a warm amber, they circled back toward Union Station. Ellis gestured. Same train. She nodded. Always on time. They sat together on the same marble bench. The crowd thickened, and still no one looked twice at them. A kind of peace. He turned to her. Do you ever miss it? The big house, the headlines, the gravity of it all. She thought for a long time, then smiled. Not sad, just full. No, she said, not once. He looked at her with a softness that had aged into certainty. Because now, she continued, I don't wake up afraid of trains. She gestured toward track 7 where the engine was just beginning to idle. I used to dream of missing it, or of falling onto the tracks, or worse, of getting on and not knowing where it would go. And now, he asked. She looked at him, the lines in her face catching the gold of the setting sun. Now, she said, I decide the destination. And that's everything. The horn blew again, louder this time, and the train pulled out. Not for her, not today. But she watched it anyway. Because sometimes you needed to watch something leave, to believe it was really gone. And sometimes you needed to see it pass, to know you weren't on it anymore.